Hello, this is a lecture on government, politics, the economy, automation, robots, and so forth, employment, unemployment. I had said that I was just going to do an update of the material in the PDF. However, I'm just going to go through the whole thing because it structures my lecture a little bit better than it would have if I had just tried to pull together all of the voluminous information that I would try to share with you, and I'm going to try not to because there's too much. It's more than you need. So without any further ado, let me share my screen. And that's not going to be very interesting until I do this. All right. Now let me say that in this lecture, I'm going to talk about some things which are not represented on any of the slides. Some of those things will be on the exam. I will tell you what those are when I get there. So I might forget about it when I go through the final exam review, or I may mention it and you look for it. Well, you're not hearing it if you're not watching this video. Anyway, so never mind. The usual decorations, I need to update those. I'm just going to skip those now. All right, we're going to start with some political sociology. Max Weber, our friend you've heard much about. He defined power. What is power over others? It's the ability to get them to do what you want even if they don't want to do it. Pretty straightforward. There are other aspects of power which you're probably familiar with but may not have thought about in these terms. Bachrach and Baratz in 1962 said, well, that's, Weber's right about that, but there's a second type, or a variation that's important that we see a lot of in the modern world, particularly in government. That's the ability to prevent something from happening, to stall a decision. If you've been following the news, you're aware of the impasse between the Republican and Democratic parties on extending any aid to people who are unemployed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's not necessarily an example of that, but there are many ways through the institutional rules that govern the way parliaments, congresses, and regulatory agency works that make it possible to prevent something from changing, to prevent a decision from being made. Stephen Lukes in 1974 added a third face of power. That's the ability to kind of control the media, the discourse, the public discourse, so that certain options aren't even considered possible. They're just too crazy. We won't, So that's kind of an ideological power, really. Okay. Government is an organization in which power is institutionalized. Weber also defined the state famously, and this is a definition that's still used often. The organization that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a defined territory. Usually we would call that the government. What does that mean? Well, that means that certain agents are entitled by the state to, if circumstances warrant, they may use force, violence against a person in order to get them to do what they want. Now, it can't just be anything, of course. The key is legitimate use of violence. So that's one reason we see a lot of police officers suffering no consequences from shootings, because it may have been determined that the use of violence was legitimate. It was appropriate under the circumstances, and there can be those situations. As we know, there are others as well. So again, the key is legitimate, but it makes sense that there should be, okay, as an example, think about this. We live in a federal political system, so there's our nested levels of government. If you live in Houston, who are some of these people who can use violence against you legitimately? Well, Houston Police Department, City of Houston. It's in Harris County Sheriff, the constables. again, if it is what the situation calls for, hopefully there aren't that many, I don't think, that are just taking advantage of that because they can. It does happen. Additionally, the state. We're under, the state has power over us. State government has agents, has individuals who are empowered to use violence if it is legitimate use. The Department of Public Safety, state troopers, there are other state agencies as well where you have armed individuals. And the federal government, we have transportation safety agencies. Some of those folks are armed. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, drug enforcement, FBI, up to and including the military, which fortunately they're rarely used. We rarely encounter someone in the military telling us what to do unless we are a member of the military. So, okay. He also defined politics, general competition to obtain resources, material, symbolic, or power using the established institutional channels generally. And Weber defined authority. That is power which most people believe is legitimate. It's, it's okay that this person has this power. They need to be in charge of this aspect of the operation of the organization. So he gave us several kinds of legitimacy as well. We'll get to that in a moment. G. William Domhoff is someone who studied the existence or the possible existence of a ruling class in the United States. The idea that there is an identifiable class of individuals, and not necessarily by name, but by economic position and so forth, that typically get things to go the way they prefer they go in the political sphere, where you have a conflict between two groups. Is there one group which always seems to get its way? Well, he has identified what he believes is a ruling class in the United States, a social upper class. And many of the people in this class are owners and upper level managers of corporations, but there's also foundation directors, people who work in think tanks, which are institutions that come up with policy suggestions, papers that are presented to government officials to consider. They're all part of what C. Wright Mills, who came up with the idea of the sociological imagination, called the power elite. Although in Mills' formulation back in the 60s, it included the upper level management of the military, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and primarily the directors of the largest corporations, as well as the president and the inner circle, the leaders of Congress and so forth. That was the power elite for Mills. Weber gave us more definitions. Ideal types, remember, something can be considered to fall into one of these categories and not have all of these features. Three kinds of authority you find in political systems. Rational legal, that's where the authority or alternatively the legitimacy of the government is based upon adherence to some written document like a constitution. These are usually bureaucratically organized organizations. This is common in modern states, in the West, in United States, Canada, many parts of Asia. India is the world's largest rational legal government. So anyway, you have laws and other documents and rules that have to be followed that establish the legitimacy. Part of that is there are periodic elections. That's one of the rules. So then you have traditional authority. That's an older style. That goes way back. You're talking here about, a monarchy, for instance, where you have a king, but it's basically based upon tradition, as you might guess, being called traditional. It's sort of the belief the way it's been done before is the way we need to continue to do it. Divine right of kings, for instance. So he had a few varieties of that he discussed. You don't need to worry about that. Charismatic authority, that's where someone is in charge of a governmental political organization, this organization that ends up with power over people and can legitimately use violence. The legitimacy is not based on a written constitution or even on tradition. It's the charisma, some special unique features of an individual that ends up in charge that are the basis for his or her legitimacy. Often these might be revolutionary leaders. Fidel Castro could be an example. Lenin in Russia might be an example. Could be, religious leaders. The Ayatollah Khomeini, if you recall him, in the 1979 Iranian Revolution, where the Shah of Iran was overthrown, much to the dismay of the United States. So, okay, and one big problem with charismatic authority, it doesn't last well. It's hard to pass on charisma. So what typically happens is there's a process which has to be done before the charismatic leader is gone, that Weber called the routinization of charisma. You create rules and procedures and so forth, or formal organizations that are governed by rules. If the ideas, the ideology, the beliefs of these charismatic leaders and whatever they've accomplished is going to persist. Otherwise, it can just fall apart. Here we have some examples. Types of government, you'll go through this in more detail, but just in brief. And democracy is ruled by citizens. Direct democracy, everybody can participate in basically all decisions. You find this, the word democracy, demokratia, comes to us from the Greek. Demos is people, kratia related to rule. And they had a form of direct democracy in the city of Athens. It would not, all citizens, as so defined, could participate and would gather on a hill called the Nix, which looked out over the Parthenon, wow, I'm blanking that, the hill. Oh, well. Anyway, sorry about that. But it looked out over the ancients, the city. It was up on a hill near, above the Hill of the Muses is the name of the hill where the assembly, the People's Assembly, met to debate just about everything. Going to war with another city, for instance, everyone would have a say in that. What are we going to do to these people who've rebelled? Every citizen, now citizens for the Greeks were just males. And slavery was common in ancient Greece and in Athens. It's not completely true that people had the luxury of debating government policy and decisions because slaves were doing all the work. That's not the case. But you will often hear that. Women were not part of it, of course, in those days. Male citizens of the city of Athens. So I will remember the name of the hill the Parthenon sits on, the big granite block that towers over modern Athens, but it doesn't, it'll probably be after this lecture. It's not important. Monarchy is ruled by a single individual, a king of sorts or a queen. There's absolute and constant, going back. Representative democracy, that is what we have in the United States and in most other actually existing democracies. Direct works only in a small group, really. I personally would not want to be involved in every decision that's made by a government. In representative democracy, people elect leaders to represent their interests. Often they don't, but they sound like they will when they're campaigning. So moving on, monarchy, king or queen, something along those lines, not necessarily named such. Absolute and constitutional. Absolute, the king has absolute power, as you might suspect. It may have some input from an assembly of sorts or from the nobility, the aristocrats, the most powerful citizens that do not hold power, and sometimes if you read English history and French, not so much French history, but English history, there's constant dynastic struggles between the family who are giving a birth, who to successive generations of kings, of leaders, and families who believe they should be the ones who are in charge. So constitutional monarchy is what you find in the UK. Oh, the largest monarchy in the world, by the way, is Thailand, I believe. Largest democracy is India. Remember that for the exam. What is the largest democracy? Let me write that down here. Largest democracy in the world in terms of the number of people. India. All right. Oligarchy is ruled by a small group. It could be a group of people, wealthy people, or simply people who manage to obtain power over some agencies that can engage in repression of some sort and keep people at bay. So probably you could, for Domhoff, the United States is more an oligarchy than a democracy because we have a ruling class, a small group. It's not as small perhaps as the traditional oligarchies. That term, like, well, anyway, never mind that. So ruled by a small group. That'll be on the test. Oligarchy. Dictatorship is rule by one or more people, where in general, almost every aspect of society is controlled by that leader or those people around him. The economy, sometimes, definitely the government. They might, if you speak against them, you may end up in jail or worse, and so forth. Totalitarian dictatorship is the most extreme version of that. You can have authoritarian democracy, and authoritarianism can kind of fade into dictatorship and totalitarian dictatorship. Totalitarian, by the word total is embedded in the word, total control. So Citizens United decision was a Supreme Court decision which more or less restored the ability of people and groups with a lot of money to contribute just as much money as they chose to their preferred candidates in an election. It's very controversial. Basically, well, typically it's a corporation that we're talking about. Corporations can make unlimited contributions to political action committees, to PACs, PACS. You should know that for the test. Citizens United, look it up if you need to. I don't have the details. Yes, I probably do. Just one moment. Somewhere here I have details on Citizens United. Did. If I don't, I should have. So all right. Well, it seems that I do not. So let's back up. Don't worry about Citizens United. Know what pluralism is instead. That's kind of the counter to this theory that there's a ruling class. This is brought, or the power elite. There was a conflict or was a debate in American political sociology that continues to a certain extent, and it's rooted in the functionalist versus conflict theory debates and difference of opinion upon how society operates. Pluralism in the 1950s and 60s was the dominant notion of how American democracy functioned. It was believed that interest groups competed with one another to advance their own agenda. Interest groups could be labor unions, in other words, people representing workers, versus corporations, versus organizations that formed for a specific purpose, a conservation group, an environmental group, and that they were all pretty much on a level playing field. No one interest necessarily had more power than any other, and they would debate this and come to an agreement, a consensus. Everybody would be happy with the resolution, and things would go on as expected. That was called pluralism, the idea that there were plural interest groups, many interest groups in the United States, and they all kind of were equal, had an equal amount of power. Well, the elite theorists said, no, that is not so. There are some with more power to control how the political system operates. So you can decide for yourself which side of that divide you think has more going for it. But just know the word pluralism, what that is. It may actually be in a slide, but I don't think so. I think I took it out. We don't need to worry about that or that. Oh, there we go. There's pluralism. It is there. Structural functionalist theory, no inherent advantage to wealth. Of course not. Group competition, and here we have elite theory. Mills again, that I mentioned earlier. Okay, now I somehow, okay. All right, there's one slide here that's out of order. Just give me 1 second here. There we go. Populism. You may, if you follow the news, you hear people talk about populist leaders. By people, I mean the talking heads on television, journalists, the people they're interviewing, professors, and so forth. Populism. Now, in Europe, populism is always has a negative connotation. It doesn't necessarily have to. Historically, it did not in the United States. There was something called the populist movement, which you'll learn about if you take American history from Reconstruction to the present. It was shortly before the Jim Crow era really began, and when segregation and racism was basically institutionalized, made legal. So populist movement that in the United States was a movement of farmers for the most part. They were very popular and powerful in Texas. Farmers, workers to a certain extent, but not so much. In the Midwest and the South, sharecroppers, for instance, you had both black and white people sharecropping, which meant, if you don't know, you would be given some land to work that belonged to someone else, but you had to produce a share. You had to give a share of your crop to the landowner, and it was a hard life. You typically had to go into debt at a company store, perhaps run by the landowner in order to get the seeds to plant and equipment for a new plow, whatever it might be. And then you pay your debts out of the money that you made from your share of the crops. And if prices fell, or if your crops are being shipped to another market and the railroad raises their prices, or your currency becomes worth less due to inflation, it just makes it worse. Well, sharecroppers and farmers, regardless of their I will use the word race because that is, it's socially constructed, but it does mean something. It has an impact. So it was a multiracial coalition in the beginning, and things like that tend to frighten the authorities, the powers that be, particularly in the South. It was eventually, I would say, subverted, but in any case, they were very influential right up until the election of 1896, when their ideas lost out to notions of free trade for American industry, really represented by William McKinley. Did I say 1896? Might have been 1892. Anyway, so, but populism, it sounds like, you know, it has something to do with the people. Say you're a populist, you want to rule in the interest of the people. But often it doesn't really turn out to be that way. You're manipulating the people to gain power. You're manipulating their problems, their grievances, typically economic, sometimes cultural. The idea of making America great again is implying it's no longer great for one reason or another. You've heard all of the suspects that were mentioned by our leaders over the last few years, all of the enemies, all of the people making our life hard in the United States, almost always outside the United States. What happened, in my view, was a lot of people lost out as the economy became globalized, as trade was freed, and we had to compete more than we had up to that time been, we were exposed to more competition, lower wages. So there's a recent book, the authors escape me, I'm most of the way through it. It's very difficult. Trade wars or class wars. These things that our president is engaged in, trade wars with everyone, in their view, these things are really, they really reflect an imbalance in the distribution of earnings within countries. People are not getting an appropriate share of the wealth they're producing through their labor. And that imbalance can be exported in order to stabilize the situation in the economically, to keep the flow of money in balance, so to speak. It's more than I want to go into. But anyway, let me back up. In any case, there are a lot of people did, lose their jobs when plants closed, needless to say. People are losing their jobs now. So populists, and Trump is an example, also Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, again, world's largest democracy, India. They're called populists. Sometimes Putin is, not always, but they're elected. Putin is elected, but the elections are in no way fair. So, but populism is not really a political ideology. It's not left or right, conservative or liberal. It is a political logic, a strategy for obtaining power. In the analysis of John B. Judas in The Populist Explosion, I recommend it highly. So again, they talk about, often a return to some better days, some pre-existing world where everything was great. Ronald Reagan, who was president from 80 to 88, trafficked in some of this. He was Morning in America was the theme of his re-election campaign. The new day is shining. We're back. We've left the malaise of the Carter era. We're a powerful country again. So some populists in Europe are starting to clash with, or have been clashing with, the leaders of the European Union, because they're rolling back some of the rights which every citizen of Europe, of the EU, had come to expect. Freedom of the press is under attack to a greater extent than it is in the United States. As you know, our president has waged a war against what he calls the fake news media. Basically, any news that's bad for his re-election chances is labeled as fake news. If you are a fan of the president, I apologize. I don't expect you do not have to agree with me. Sometimes I just share my opinion, particularly lately, about our leaders at several levels. So moving on, Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, Andrzej Duda in Poland, the Law and Justice Party. They've been really eliminating free trial, free press, or working in that direction. In Poland, there are now many cities that have declared LGBT free zones, parts of the city you cannot go into if you are LGBT. That, you know, is definitely they you know, it's people who feel some threatened by cultural change and by increasing openness towards other ways of being. The refugee crisis, refugees leaving Syria and other parts of the Middle East for Europe, going through Greece often and Turkey, has aggravated many Europeans. There's very strong anti-immigrant sentiment in general in the EU, and people like Viktor Orban have taken advantage of that to gain power. Brexit, Britain breaking away from the EU, that campaign was run by people that we would call populist. They were not interested in Great Britain anymore. They wanted to go back to Little England. They lost too much of their power to the EU. Their right to fish wherever they want and take as much fish as possible with their fishing fleets. Variety of other things. I won't go further into that. So as I said, often it's populist leaders are exploiting economic grievances that may be legitimate. If you lose your job and you can't find another one where you live, or the one you find doesn't pay anything like what you're used to, that is a problem for you. That's a real thing. And the populists will often find an other to blame. In the case of the United States, initially, it was immigrants from Mexico that were being blamed early in the campaign. And then we closed our borders briefly to people from most countries where the dominant religion was Islam. Just a whole raft of things where the prejudices and fears, xenophobia of maybe a third of the citizens of the United States was being exploited for political purposes. So many people are worried about the growth of populism, and particularly now that we're entering the worst economic catastrophe since the Great Depression of the 1930s, if possibly it could be the worse than that. We don't know yet. We don't know what's yet to come. Many were fearful that populism could kind of drift into fascism in many cases before this. And now I think it's even more likely you're going to see even populists becoming more extreme and beginning to sound more like Hitler and Mussolini did in the 1930s, because they played by the same playbook. You found some other group that was responsible for all of the problems of that country. Now, in the case of Germany, as I said, the Great Depression was, we'll talk about that in a moment, but there was a lot of inflation and deflation and people out of work. There was a sentiment that somehow they had gotten kind of a bad deal at the Versailles Peace Conference at the end of the First World War. They were required to pay a lot of money, more than they could probably ever pay off, although they finally did, I think in 2015. No, well, it was after 2010 or shortly before, they finished paying off all of these reparations they had been required to pay to France and Great Britain, who really needed the money to pay the United States back, at least in the First World War. So American politics was driving what was going on in Europe to a certain extent, because the Germans were being, squeezed. And Hitler came along and he had the answers to everything that was going wrong. It was primarily, of course, who was that other that Hitler blamed? Well, we know it was the Jews, sometimes the gypsies, and sometimes communists. Communists are a popular target of fascists. Fascism is a totalitarian political system, and they operate by finding an other to blame for these problems. So what happened with the last big outbreak of fascism? How did that end? Well, it ended with the Second World War. 70 to 85 million people were killed or died during the Second World War, a 6-year period. That was 3% of the world's population. For one, I don't want to see fascism come back, but it's been creeping back through Viktor Orban in Hungary. And some of the rhetoric we hear sounds familiar, sounds similar to things that were floated before. So keep your eyes open. If you don't, well, it may not be your eyes that are important at some point, but all right, let's move on to the economy. Sociologists study the economy, but in a different way than economists do. In my view, mainstream economics is detached from reality. It's become highly mathematized. They like mathematical models that allow them to understand decision making in the economic sphere with algebraic and more sophisticated equations. So sociologists are more interested in not so much in the economic choices that people make, on the assumption that people are always making rational decisions and they have all the information they need and all the information is correct, and their needs, their wants are not something that is manipulated by anyone outside. They're endogenous, they come from within. So I think I've just listed several assumptions they make, which does not fit reality. No offense to any economic students out there. Anyway, so sociologists are concerned with, the parts of the economic system and how it relates to other parts, other social institutions, historical change of this relationship and of these components, and how economic change and the nature of the economy and work and jobs, what impact does that have on individual lives and families? So that goes back to C. Wright Mills again, the sociological imagination, connection between public issues and private troubles. So we live in a capitalist economic system. Capitalism is based on competition in markets, and private ownership is the norm, as opposed to, for instance, in a communist system where the state might own everything. The means of production privately held, and people produce goods and engage in market competitions in order to make a profit. Others have defined it as a system where capital and labor, capital being the means of production and money, for instance, are held privately. And there are markets where you sell both, buy and sell both. There's a labor market, there are capital markets, financial markets. Others have defined it, Jeffrey Ingham, which I'm fond of, 3 essential elements. This sounds much like the same. Adam Smith was the first theorist of capitalism, really. The system based on market exchange between free individuals. There would be a division of labor and free trade. At the time, this was controversial in Britain. The economic system that was dominant in Europe and the UK and Great Britain at the time Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, something called mercantilism, where basically states wanted to accumulate a surplus of gold or something of extreme value, and that wasn't necessarily through market competition. It could be military conquest. Hence the Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, in gold and silver, or mining silver in many cases. Operating mines, working the native the indigenous peoples, first peoples, to death in mines. Potosi was the largest silver mine in the world. It was in Bolivia. People still mine silver there. If you own a smartphone, it's very likely you have some silver from Potosi. And it's also almost certain that some of that silver and some of these other metals is the product of child labor. So when you're thinking about ethical sourcing, ethical provenance of the products you buy, just remember your smartphone. There aren't any that are totally free of exploitation of children. So Marx would refer to that as an example of the fetishism of commodities. Now, a fetish is not really in the same sense as you might think of in terms of sexuality, what Freud might have discussed. It's something which represents something else. And for Marx, a commodity, which is the essence of capitalism, was the production of commodities, which are these things that are sold on a market. They're produced by the proletariat, organized, controlled by capitalists, the bourgeoisie. The fetishism of commodities is the idea that the social relations between that characterize the capitalist system are embedded in that commodity. So I just gave you an example of that. Child labor being embedded in your smartphone. So the relations of production is how society is organized, how people are paid, what limits are there on how old or young you have, how young is too young to work, all these things, the level of exploitation in society. Those are the social relations, the relations between the classes. The productive relations, the relations of production, on the other hand, refer to technology and factories and so forth. So a social formation has these two parts in Marxist theory: the relations of these relations of production and the I grabbed the wrong word. Forget what I was just saying because I forgot. The means of production is the wrong word, but there are the social relations and the productive relations. So basically that's those two components, but there Marxists use some other more specific terms which are escaping me at the moment. I'm sorry, sometimes things escape from old folks such as I. All right, so Karl Marx thought capitalism was temporary, but it was necessary. He did not really think capitalism per se was bad. It was a stage we had to go through. It was just the way history operated. Capitalism would develop our capacity to provide for everyone, and that would become widespread once capitalism gave way to socialism. And part of the process through which that would happen was what he called contradiction and crises. Contradiction is, for Marx and for others, a case where two opposing forces meet and there's a resolution. Something new comes out of it. The thesis and the antithesis are the terms for these two forces. The synthesis is the new system. So there will typically be a conflict, a contradiction between the the techniques of production and the relations of production. I discussed this, I think, when I talked about the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Too many people were bound to the soil and could not go to these cities and take the increasingly open jobs working in factories because they were bound to the soil. Feudalism had to collapse before capitalism could come into its own. Now, Marxists have said the main contradiction of capitalism, and there are many, is basically that we have the technology, we have the ability to produce everything that everybody needs to provide it, but we do not. People are still Um, they don't have enough food. They don't have shelter. They don't have clothing, don't have jobs. We have the ability to take care of that, but it doesn't happen. Why does it not happen? Well, there are several explanations for that. I will not go into them. But capitalism is beset by crises. Sometimes these crises might, you can sugarcoat them, and in economics, they'll call them the business cycle, the ups and downs of the economy. Often what you'll have is, well, Marxists debate things endlessly. So you could have overproduction. People are producing more than they're paying people, and they're not paying people enough for them to be able to buy it all. So suddenly they produce too much, and you have too many producers of something, and there is a crash. There's an economic crisis. Prices drop because there's a glut of this stuff. Factories close. People lose their jobs. Some that manage to hang on may buy up the assets of the companies that have gone bankrupt, and eventually the system's restored and it runs again until it goes to a new crisis. Now, Marx felt there would be a final crisis because he believed that there would be the workers would become increasingly squeezed as part of the resolution of each crisis within the capitalist system. Eventually, they would revolt, say enough is enough, and so seize the means of production, in his words. And then you would have socialism. After a period of socialism, you'd have something called communism. He didn't write much about socialism at all. He wrote even less about communism. Nevertheless, he's credited as being the founder of communist social organization. Marx wrote about capitalism. So anyway, Max Weber, Capitalism, the Satisfaction of Human Needs and Wants by Industrial Production by Bureaucratic Enterprises. Remember his theory of bureaucracy, in which net profit is rationally calculated as part of his view of the increasing rationalization of human social life. Moving on, some anti-non and almost capitalist systems. Communism, I mentioned that. Collective ownership of means of production, land, much private property. China was probably is the largest nation that officially calls itself communist. Its ruling elite are members of the Communist Party of China, but for all intents and purposes, they are capitalists now. It's an authoritarian capitalism. They maintain a tight control, but most of the economic output in China now comes from, not from state-owned enterprises, but from privately owned. Now, private may mean it's owned by people with connections to the Communist Party of China. Nevertheless, socialism is a system where you don't have, everything is not owned publicly or collectively, but some of the key industries are. The railroads, the electric utilities, maybe the mines. In the case of Britain, the coal mines were owned by the state for quite some time after the Second World War. And decisions about production and distribution and prices were made by some central authorities. Social democracy is a related concept. That social democracy often has elements of socialism, of public ownership, but most importantly, you have a generous social safety net that has been eroded since the late 70s with the advent of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is going to be a term that will be on the exam, so I'm going to tell you what that is in a moment. Welfare states overlap again with social democracy. These are basically capitalist states, but there are some, again, there's a social safety net. So these have been, especially since the financial crisis of 2008 and the impact on European governments and the demand for austerity from countries receiving aid from Germany, the wealthiest country in the EU, these social programs have been rolled way back. Retirement ages increased. the amount of pensions, of old age pensions people were receiving, particularly in Greece, was cut significantly. Number of other changes were made. So is this where I should talk about neoliberalism? No, I'll wait for a moment. And one of the reasons that this rollback has been necessary is that capital, meaning investments, is highly mobile now. If you are investing in a country and you fear that taxes will go up or that the value of the currency is going to go down, affecting your investments, you can simply sell your stock and buy stock elsewhere. It was not always the case that you could do that everywhere, and I'll get to that in a moment. There have been a history of the economy, historical changes. Some of the key changes, the biggest one perhaps, at least since the Neolithic Revolution, where farming became replaced hunting and gathering and pastoralism as the principal way people survived. And that's an old one, that's 6,000 BCE. So the Industrial Revolution began in England in the early 19th century, early 1800s, around 1800, but there were elements of it, inventions and so forth in the late 18th century that were important, but it began in England. Partly that's because agricultural productivity was higher than elsewhere in Europe, and so you didn't need as many people working on farms. That freed up people for factory work. Also, they had a lot of coal and iron deposits, coal for powering steam engines and iron for building the steam engines. They introduced a factory system of production, mass production, interchangeable parts. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations wrote famously about the division of labor and using a pin factory as a metaphor, P-I-N, pins you might use in a shirt, not to write with. So anyway, in a factory system, you didn't have to be very skilled to be useful in producing a product. You could be doing just one simple thing all day long, every day. If you've ever worked for a factory like that, you know what I'm talking about. It is boring. I worked for a couple of factories where some worse than others. I don't want to go off into that. So scientific management was a craze among the corporate elite in the United States and Europe, sometimes called Taylorism. That's kind of the application of again, it's a rationalization of production in a sense. You would have an expert come in and do a time and motion study of your production processes. They would watch people work. They would take films of people doing their jobs. Then they would come back with a plan saying, you can do it this way. And you began to they give you a standard operating procedure of sorts and break jobs into even smaller parts, which were very specific about how one had to do one job. That's called de-skilling. More skill, even less skill was required. You were completely controlled. You were following a script. So most factory production now takes place outside the United States. In China, for instance, there's a lot of Vietnam and other parts of Asia, South Korea. So you will still find this system, things that look like repetitive motions converted into commodities in many, for instance, a Foxconn produces most of Apple's products. I don't know if this link works anymore. You can Google that, you will find the correct link. So deindustrialization refers to a period where basically factories in the United States, steel mills, automobile plants, shipyards were closing because we were being outcompeted by Japan, by China, even by Europe. This as a result of the revival of their industrial capacity after the Second World War, which we helped finance, and it was very important that we did. Well, one reason it was done was to prevent the advance of communism. At the end of the Second World War, Russian troops under Joseph Stalin controlled much of Eastern Europe, and they kept it, as you know, until 1989, 1990, when things changed. But deindustrialization was a shock for Americans. It used to be the case you could, with a high school diploma, go get a job in your community at a factory and make enough money, particularly if it was a unionized plant, to buy a house, buy a new car every few years, start a family, have a stay-at-home wife, have children, take vacations. Not anymore. So the factors that led to deindustrialization, the Europeans and Japanese built, they had to rebuild. They had some newer technology than we did, more efficient technology. Globalization, as a result of trade agreements, we began to compete with, our workers competed with lower cost labor in other nations, particularly China. Also, people began to buy different kinds of things, cars and things made of steel. We still had them. We didn't buy them as often. A greater proportion of our disposable income went for other kinds of things which weren't necessarily mass produced. The service sector became more important, where people were consuming services, for instance, concerts, or you're going on vacations. And today, you know, it might have been, or 6 months ago, a year ago, you might go to a place and get the latest creation by a mixologist, designer cocktails, high-end restaurants that were casual and attracted more people than the stereotypical, stuffy, must dress up high-end restaurant of the 1950s. Another big change has been the decline of unionized labor. Labor unions never employed more than a quarter of the workforce. In 2010, it was down to 12%. The owners of corporations embarked on a campaign to weaken unions and to prevent unions from coming into new factories. Laws were passed prohibiting certain practices, which made it more difficult for unions to retain enough power to represent their workers. In contract negotiations with unions, they were often typically, rather than getting raises for their workers, they were negotiating returns of benefits or more limited wages, or allowing new people to come in and not join the union in order to obviate a threat to close the plant and move to a cheaper area, an area where labor was less expensive. So they gave back a lot in addition to losing their share of the number of workers in the United States. Okay. Another big change is something which has been called by David Harvey, I think, was the person who came up with this term. I'm not completely sure. Fordism versus post-Fordism. Fordism is mass production of things for mass consumption. It's named after Henry Ford, who built the first automobile plants. And there wasn't a lot of variation in what the automobiles looked like. In the beginning, all of them were the same color. Ford used to say you can get it in any color you want as long as that color is black. There were just a few models. Post-Fordism, on the other hand, what David Harvey called the regime of flexible accumulation. There are fewer products. Well, excuse me. Let me go back. Okay, you're not mass producing, but you will consume products to order almost. There are fewer products perhaps, but there's a greater variety of styles and so forth. something called just-in-time manufacturing was the term for this, where you would not, the old model, you might in a factory, they would just keep producing refrigerators, and when the economy changed, there was a recession and sales fell, they would, well, the way it worked, they make refrigerators. You might work for a union, for instance, working in the factory making refrigerators. The company employed a human resources department to hire people. They had an accounting department to do the books and a payroll department, and they had a sales force which would go out and sell the products to small retailers and on main streets throughout the United States. The economy had declined and people went out of work and they were not buying as many refrigerators, and your warehouse that your workers were always filling with refrigerators to be shipped out to meet to fulfill orders that the sales force had collected, that warehouse was full. So the workforce would be laid off and they'd keep selling refrigerators until it was time to call people back. Maybe that business cycle swung around, the economy picked up. They called the workers back. They would be drawing unemployment while they waited. Unemployment insurance, as well as some forms of government assistance, what used to be called food stamps, now SNAP. Those are considered stabilizers, economic stabilizers. They kick in and provide people money when there's an economic downturn, like we're having right now. So we'll get to that in a moment. So what, in a way, all this is related to, in a way, is something called neoliberalism. Now, liberalism, you may think of liberal versus conservative. That's not what it means. Adam Smith was an advocate of liberalism in 1776. What basically this meant was a system that couples political rights to self-government with economic rights, free trade, for instance, and no limitations upon entry into a market, minimal monopolies. You could start a business and you didn't have to worry about Walmart squashing you right out of the gate. So neoliberalism is a form of liberalism, but it has more emphasis on free trade. There should be no barriers to trade across nations. And in essence, neoliberalism, you can summarize it, the notion that the market is always right. David Harvey, in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, which I would recommend as well if you are into such things, defined it as a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. So some of the way unions operated clashed with this. Harvey, if you recall, and if you're in my sociology class, and I think I covered this in social problems, Thomas Piketty's work, where he had a curve that showed declining inequality in the 30s, and then it picks back up in the 70s. Well, that's when neoliberalism came into its own. It was, these ideas were the most powerful advocates of this, at least among elected leaders, Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, but there were economists and political think tanks and other advocacy groups that had been pushing these ideas for quite some time, so it wasn't anything new, but it came into power with Reagan and Thatcher. So although Reagan wasn't completely a neoliberal, he used monetarist ideas, don't need to worry about that, manipulating the money supply to correct economic problems. So, but in any case, we had a wave of deregulation, the notion being that some regulations were inhibiting trade and private property rights and free trade as well. So regulations were rolled back. That has continued, of course. It was sometimes said that the financial crisis of 2008 should have ended the whole neoliberal fad, but it did not. We just kicked back into gear again. Um, I don't have time to explain the basis for all these claims I'm making, so you can discount them as you like, but just remember neoliberalism. Let's call it the market is always right. That's what you should know. All right, so Fordism and post-Fordism. All right, let's talk about unemployment. There's a lot more of it than there was at the beginning of the year right now. It's part of the business cycle in a sense. When sales go down, companies lay people off, they're unemployed. The business cycle swings around to another period where it's improving, people go back to work. It once was believed the business cycle was over before the 2008 crisis, definitely, but people were making those noises. So, but the notion that we'd beaten the business cycle, we were seeing a boom without end that goes back to like the late 90s, the Clinton era. There were some speed bumps like the dot-com crash. People went all in on the internet and everything was for sale online, but more companies formed than could possibly survive. So a lot of investors lost their money, went through a bit of retrenchment. One aspect of neoliberalism, which has been exported and globalized, if you are, well, let me hold that for a second. I'll return to that. But unemployment can be of several types. It can be cyclical, related to the business cycle, these ups and downs of economic production, or it can be structural, where the skills you have are no longer in demand. Or it can be what's called frictional. You're between jobs. You know you're going to another job, but at the moment you've either quit the one you had and you're looking for another one, or you are, just waiting. You have some time between. I'm guessing that this pandemic-induced unemployment might be called. I'm struggling for a way to categorize it in these categories. Somebody eventually will. You could say it's cyclical, but it could also be structural, because unemployment due to natural disasters, you could call it structural because of what's happened to your city, nobody needs your skills. So in this case, it's worldwide, so I'm not certain how to characterize it. We're dealing with something we've never dealt with before. So stay tuned for further development. So I'll probably ask about structural unemployment. There's also something called natural unemployment or classical unemployment. I don't remember the exact definition of that, but I'll ask about structural unemployment. Skills you have are no longer in demand. So I already talked about that earlier today, I believe. All right. There's also a lot of things done by the family which have become commodities for sale on the market. Services, dog walkers, childcare, caring of your aging parents. Some social services have been privatized. Some services that used to be publicly offered have been turned over to the private sector. Trash collection is one they've been able to work with. People have been desperate for years to sell all of our drinking water to private corporations. The idea is that governments are inherently inefficient in the way they do business. Government intervention in the market, this is neoliberalism again, is always negative. It always causes problems, so it's best they stay out. The market's always right. not the areas of the world where they have privatized the water supply really regret it. So remember that if it ever comes up on a bond issue or an election in the city you're living in or whatever, vote against it, vote no. Because in the case of, for instance, producing drinking water, when they would do their analysis and take bids, the way they were doing it, publicly owned and managed, always came in cheaper than what the private sector could do, because they would have to pay a certain amount of their revenue as profits to shareholders. So here's what's happened with the unemployment rate since 1990. These blue bars reflect economic downturns. We have one at during the administrations of George Herbert Walker Bush, a recession. So unemployment went up in the early part of the Clinton administration, peaked right around the time he was elected. You may recall, well, no, I don't need to go there, but Clinton ran on fixing the economy. That was his big issue. And he did bring the economy back into surplus from a state of deficit, balanced the budget for the first time, and who knows when. Talk about that in a moment as well. Here we have the dot-com crash that I mentioned. So unemployment, here's the rate, 6%. Economists used to say, when I took economics in high school, that 4% was the natural rate. That was frictional unemployment. So I don't think 4% of the people are between jobs most of the time. Okay, now these numbers come from people who say they're looking for work. If you are just tired of it, you're tired of looking, can't find anything, you give up, you're not even counted. Okay, so anyway, it comes down to about 4% here. Economists sometimes want to push it up to 5 or 6 as the natural rate of unemployment. So here's the dot-com crash. It's up to about 6. It goes down to about 5. Here's a period when they thought it should be 5. This was when Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve, said, "We've entered an era of boom without end." This is the Great Recession. Now, a recession, all right, what is that? You're hearing the term. We're in one. It's bigger than this one. We know that already. That's defined in the United States usually as a significant decline in gross domestic product for more than a few months. What's gross domestic product? GDP. Well, that's the total value of all goods and services produced within a country. In other words, it's the total economic output. That's another good one for the test. GDP, gross domestic product. Okay, so right now the U.S. gross domestic product, or before this started, it was expected to hit $22 trillion in 2020. It's not going to make that. But it was in 2018, it was about 20 trillion. The global GDP, I looked that up earlier and now I don't have it. Well, I was meant to look it up. I'm going to tell you the entire planetary, I'm thinking it's around 40-ish something. Yeah, let's see what we got here. No, it's more than that, 142. So we have about a seventh in the United States. A seventh of the total economic output now is produced in the United States. So, all right, close that. All right, so here is the pandemic. It almost hit 15%. This reflects the July 2020 numbers that just came out a week or so ago. The end of, I believe, the second quarter. So anyway, there's that. We know it's bad. It's 10.2% as of July 2020. But the thing is, this doesn't take into account the fact that, well, it did go down, But in many cases, these were people going back to jobs they already had. It wasn't new jobs added. You may hear that's what the economists will say. So many jobs were added in this second quarter. But because the government has been providing several sorts of economic assistance packages to the private sector and to individuals, they had the money to call people back. But that money is going away as we speak. In the case of the supplement to unemployment insurance benefits, which are not generous in Texas, I'm here to tell you, you may already know, that extra $600 expired at the end of July, and Congress cannot seem to find a middle ground or any substitute for that right now. So this is rather old, so I won't stop there. The future of the economy. We're going to see more automation, more de-skilling. We're going to see more technological unemployment. People debate that and how much there's going to be and how many people are at risk for having their jobs taken over by a machine, basically. Let's see here. Truck drivers are probably worried about the driverless trucks coming up, because truck driving had been something you could do. It's always needed people. HCC has a truck driver training program. Some people have said maybe half of US jobs could be victims of computerization. That's probably by what year? I did not write down. The OECD, a United Nations entity, said that for 14%, in 2018, said 14% of jobs are at risk of replacement by automation. And it's difficult to calculate this because, you know, the fate of a car mechanic who works on a production line is different than one who works in a repair shop. You're not going to automate the person in the repair shop, but you can probably replace the person on the production line with a robotic technology. So total jobs lost in the world by, I'm sorry, I do not have the time frames they're talking about in some of this stuff. So, technology. And I have a lot of stuff to share. All right. Continuing transition to this information economy, so-called. There have been a lot of terms for what type of capitalism we have now. There's platform capitalism, information capitalism, network, the network economy, the information economy is another. Here's one that's a new one. Surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's a big book. She's very systematic, a professor of law at Harvard. Surveillance capitalism is this era in which a lot of value is being produced by tech companies like Google and Facebook by using the data which we are giving them whenever we post, whenever we like somebody's post, whenever we purchase a product online. They're learning something about us. They're taking what they've learned, they're building models, statistical models that can predict what people with our characteristics will do. They don't need a theory to make this work. This is the so-called big data revolution. They just use correlations, and they don't have to predict. If you don't have to predict what everyone's going to do. You just have to be able to identify people most likely to buy a particular product, and they can sell that to advertisers who want their product displayed at the side of your web browser as you go through your Canvas shell looking for assignments to do. Actually, you can't see it in Canvas, I don't think, but in theory, Canvas is a different thing than Google, for instance. It's not, Canvas is not a browser. It's within Google, of course, or can be within Chrome. But when you're in there, you don't see advertising. I hope now, if you go to one of my YouTube videos, you probably do. And I hope you do go to some of them, particularly this one. So also, you have more and more people in the gig economy, Uber drivers, TaskRabbits. I had a TaskRabbit do some work for me recently. Amazon's Mechanical Turks. If you don't know what that is, look it up. You might find some, you know, some way to get some extra money working for them, but it's hard to say. I don't know what's happening with them right now. For a while, when everybody was home in the beginning, a lot of homeowners decided it was time for projects. Home Depot was very busy. I imagine TaskRabbits were very busy. Uber drivers, not so much. No air travel. Nobody to drive to and from the airport. In the next lecture, the lecture on, there's more about the impact of the pandemic on employment in there, so I'm not going to belabor that beyond what you're about to see again. Contract workers, self-employed, gig workers, what's called zero contract hour workers in the UK. Oh, I got to go back. I jumped ahead too fast. Recession I define as a downturn that lasts more than several months. In the United Kingdom, Britain, they have a more formal definition than I usually hear. 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. A depression is longer term and it has nothing to do with the business cycle. You tend to get caught in a low income equilibrium. You get caught in a trap. I'll explain that probably in a moment. Recessions are usually caused by a burst bubble or some supply shock, natural disasters sometimes, or the business cycle usually doesn't go so far that it would create a recession normally. That's not the normal cycle. So here you can, well, Mechanical Turks, you can look it up. If you don't know what TaskRabbits are, you can look that up. Sharing economy, robots. There's some photos you can look at. I'm not going to go through this. This is anyway, yeah, I will. The argument he makes is that this robot revolution is coming. It's going to put people out of work, and it's going to lead to some sort of social transformation because people are not going to, well, the people who are making the money are not going to want to pay the taxes that are required for the social programs that keep the people who can never find work, maybe again, to keep them from rebelling, causing problems for the wealthier, employed, those who still have jobs. So something will give. There will be a breaking point at which something has to change, and we're going to have a transition to a new type of social organization. We may be headed there now. This may be part of that, ahead of the robots. The robot revolution was, last I heard, postponed till 2020. Well, it's probably, robots don't get the virus, so it's probably going to accelerate. Many tech companies are finding they can function just fine without offices. That's going to have a big impact on the real estate market here in Houston. It's just beginning, really. The other shoe economically has yet to drop, and we are in a bad way already. So now some recent economic history. The Great Depression, referred to that in the 30s. Prices fell, which sounds good, but when prices fall, the people producing the items that are lower priced can't afford to pay their workers as much, so wages fall, so workers cannot buy as much, so prices fall again, and then wages fall, and it's just a death spiral of sorts until you hit rock bottom. Prices can fall no further. In the 30s, the prices for farm products, for manufactured products, all this stuff fell. Nations tried to protect themselves by putting up tariffs. It didn't work. Everybody started putting up tariffs. And it finally ground down to a point where some other ideas began to be embraced, those advanced primarily by British economist John Maynard Keynes. Keynesianism became the economic philosophy of many governments, particularly in the United States after the election of Franklin Roosevelt. Economic historians still debate the causes of the Great Depression, but the trigger was the stock market crash in the United States, October 1929. The 20s was a year when the economy was booming. Everyone thought, again, it would be a boom without end. Everybody was investing in the stock market. In those days, you could buy on margin, meaning you could buy 10 shares of stock if you only had the money for one. You would just owe for the rest. And people thought, stock's going up so fast and it'll never end. I'll eventually have made enough to pay back the initial one share is going to be worth that 10 that I just borrowed, or 9. So I'll take care of it. Well, the market crashed and people began to call in all their debts, including debts for these margins, these loans to buy stock. Your stock wasn't worth squat, but you had to pay back what it was you borrowed to buy it. It was tough on many people. My grandfather got out of the Navy just in time to make a big investment in several apartment buildings in Chicago in 1928, I think. 29 came around and all the debts were being called in. Suddenly my father's family was totally broke with no assets. My grandfather never worked again, drank himself into an early grave, etc. And here I am. But all right, so this was a worldwide event. This spread everywhere. The fact that most nations were on the gold standard, that helped transfer what was going on worldwide, because there was a global economy. People did trade with one another. They owed everybody. Every nation owed other nations something, who owed them something. And when there was a limited amount of gold, and it's hard to, the easiest way to grasp how the amount of money affects prices is to think, imagine there's only $10 in the entire world, okay? And imagine there's 10 things to buy. They're identical. So each of those things is worth $1. The price would be $1. It can't be any higher because there isn't money for more. If it was higher, some of that is going to go unsold. You're going to have to lower your prices anyway. So the amount of money that exists in the system is connected with prices. So Keynes said, well, we're stuck in this low income, low productivity equilibrium. To get out, we have to spend money we don't have, basically. And people thought he was crazy. There have been some consideration in the UK, and they finally decided, the theory was, if government borrows money to spend to stimulate the economy, it won't work. It'll either cause inflation or it's just going to replace private investment, because there's a limited amount of money available because they were on the gold standard. You can't have, your money is backed by gold. How much money you can have is a matter of how much gold is in the vaults of your central bank. Keynes said, well, no, you just have to give it a kick. You have to give the economy a kick, and eventually it will be humming along and you'll be able to repay this deficit spending financed through borrowing. Deficit spending money you don't have, borrowing to spend in some cases, although in the great crash of 2008, we saw a lot of, and it's still continuing actually, something called quantitative easing, or rather than the government borrowing money or by creating lines of credit in banks, making money available, stimulus, they're buying bonds that are already floating around, their own bonds bonds, government bonds that other people have purchased that banks hold, for instance. They buy these and that creates deposits in the banks. So the banks have money to loan out to people who want to buy a house or start a business or whatever, because banks don't, as you probably know, your money is not there. They have to keep a certain reserve. I think now it's 5%. So if all their deposits, their total deposits have been $100 million, they have to keep 5 million actual dollars there. The rest they loan out. So it's related to something called an economic multiplier. You'll learn about that if you take macroeconomics, not microeconomics. They don't deal with that sort of thing. Okay, so as I said, this depression was worldwide, except in the Soviet Union, because they were cut off from the global economy anyway. Really, they weren't. They were embargoed to a certain extent, and they embargoed back. So they managed to avoid a lot of the worst results of the Great Depression, where in the United States unemployment reached roughly 25%. At worst. So when Roosevelt was elected, there were various programs to try to deal with the Depression, and they began to work, but there was pressure to balance the budget, to end this deficit spending. So they balanced the budget and the economy crashed. Had to find a new trick, and they just, more deficit spending, and then World War II came along. And there was a lot of deficit spending. I mean, if there's an existential threat to your total way of life, which was posed by the Nazis, by Germany and Japan and Italy working together, taking over European nations, threatening us, bombing Pearl Harbor. If there's you're going to spend whatever, you're going to do what you have to do. And there was deficit spending, and it was a big. Well, anyway, it was World War II that really ended the Depression, all the money that was spent. And so we don't want to go there. All right, so after the Second World War, this period, 1946 to 71, the golden age of American capitalism, it's called. Why is that? Well, Europe was in ruins, Japan was in ruins, people were starving, people had no homes. We had not been bombed out like Europe had. There was, I think, a couple of balloons with explosives on them from some Japanese ships had floated over Oregon, as I recall, and blew up in the woods, but that was it, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, of course, the naval base. So we were the biggest show in town. If someone wanted steel, automobiles, refrigerators, whatever it was, we sold it to them. So the Marshall Plan was created, where we basically gave credits to European nations and Japan and some others. It was offered to the Soviets, they declined. Credits to purchase our goods, our steel, our automobiles, our stuff. And we sold a lot of it, and they gradually rebuilt. So there was another mechanism set up right before the end of the Second World War in 1944, the Bretton Woods system. It was kind of a monetary, or a way to manage the global monetary system, money. Okay, so we're talking about money now. What exactly is money? Have you ever wondered where money comes from? Well, I'm here to tell you. Banks create money. It's not that the government prints money. That's not where it comes from. The government may give the banks the right to create a credit on their accounts. They create deposits. And the government may print money to be used in transactions, but it's not really printing money. It can have the same effect in some cases. It's a tricky thing to pull off depending upon who you talk to. So originally money, the first money was, first coinage was produced in the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia. in Turkey, Anatolia. It was used basically for people to pay taxes. The ruler would create a coin with his image on it. It would be given to the soldiers to pay. It would pay, you pay your soldiers with that. They would go out and do what they did, harassing, guarding, whatever it was, and they would buy what they needed with these coins, which were later recalled in the form of taxes. These were tributary economies. It was all like a one-way flow of coinage between the ruler, the central government, and the people. You know, people produced most of the things they needed to survive. They produced it themselves. They didn't buy it on a market in general. There might be some exceptions. Adam Smith said money came about to kind of oil the wheels of trade. It replaced bartering. That's debatable. David Graeber, an anthropologist who wrote this book, let's see here, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, argues there's no evidence that we ever lived exclusively by bartering in the beginning. Adam Smith's story is wrong. Bartering is just trading one thing for another. And Smith would say, well, you've got to, you know, you've got to find someone who has what you need and they need what you have for this to work, and money made that easier. Well, Graeber has a different view of that. He says that there was no barter. You had economies where if somebody needed some shoes, the person who made shoes would give that to the person who needed them because they would get what they needed from others. It was more almost a gift economy. They took care of each other. They didn't trade all the time. There might be some bartering with other groups for things that they did not have in their area or could not get or did not know how to make, but in general, most trade was not trade per se. So, okay. So this idea that the government makes money in order to enable people to pay taxes, that's called chartalism, Chartalism. Let's see here. Just so you know how that's spelled, you probably see that chartalist theory. The state creates money so the citizens can pay taxes. Okay, money can be, you know, there's the medalist school and the credit school. The medalist school, you know, it's got to be backed by gold, and gold has value because it doesn't wear out. People always want it. It's shiny and pretty, and right now gold is very valuable. People have been investing in gold like they haven't in recent history. Versus the credit origin of money. Okay, credit, most sociologists would lean towards money as a credit because that the notion is the idea of a social relation, a bond between people is embedded in there. So for instance, paper money. Why do you accept paper money? As you go to the store and you cash in 100 and they take it and they give you back maybe 420s and your goods. What has just happened? Well, you had $100 bill, and that $100 bill represents a contract, a social relation with whoever has whatever it is you want. They are contractually obligated to take that as payment. So that's its value. Its value is in how it works in the social group. It doesn't have to be backed by anything. Okay. And in fact, our money is not backed by gold anymore. Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. Anyway, the Bretton Woods system, it managed many aspects of the global economy. Sorry, let me get this out of your way. I have gone well beyond where I was. Here we go. All right. I may not have gone through this and shown you all this, but anyway, now here it is. All right, so Great Depression, back again to Bretton Woods. They created the International Monetary Fund, which helped countries that got into a currency issue. Their currency became, someone was speculating on it. It became worth less than it should be, and they were having trouble paying their debts. The International Monetary Fund would loan reserve currency to countries that were in a jam if they were part of the overall global system. The World Bank would provide money to finance risky, expensive, big projects like dams and such. During this period, the exchange rate between currencies was fixed, and it was fixed relative to the price of gold and thereby to the US dollar, or to the US dollar, and the value of the dollar was fixed at $35 to 1 ounce of gold, and it was that way from 1944 until 1971, when the French began cashing in all their dollars and gold began flowing out of the United States. And Richard Nixon panicked in 1971 and ended this ability to convert your dollars into gold. I remember the time when you could do that. And some pieces of currency would be called, they look like a regular dollar, but they'd have little marks calling it a silver certificate. You could present it to any bank and get silver, actual silver from them, if they had any at the time. Gold was, convertibility was a different deal. You had to go through several other steps. It wasn't as simple as getting your silver from your gold. But money is something which is, and Graeber adheres to what you might, the class conflict school of money, insofar as there's this conflict between debtors and creditors fought over interest rates. And that is really the modern version in several views. That's what's really going, that's the class struggle that is most common today between people who owe money and people who have loaned the money, because it's in the interest of the people who owe money for inflation to kick in. Now, what is inflation? That is the rise in prices over time above the rate of increase of the rate of economic growth. It can get out of hand. Inflation, I think, has hit several thousand% in Venezuela. It happened in Germany after the First World War, where you'd need a wheelbarrow full of currency to purchase a loaf of bread. So these are the kind of things that the International Monetary Fund was supposed to be able to prevent, where something just went way out of control, and inflation was intended to be controlled by central banks and others, and inflation can result in your currency becoming basically worthless, which is bad if you owe money to another country. You can be in quite a jam. Bretton Woods took care of that, but as part of that, in addition to fixed exchange rates, there were capital controls, which meant you couldn't necessarily buy stock or invest in a corporation in Thailand or in China or in Europe. It couldn't really leave the country. You had to invest in an American corporation. If you were in Germany, you invested in a German corporation. There were capital controls. Money couldn't flow around the world in response to some event, and like it can now. And we've seen several financial crises that were brought on simply because people started investing for some reason in the currency of another country, like Thailand, and the government would have to support its currency by buying up more of it, and people keep piling in, and finally they have no more ability, no more foreign exchange to buy their own currency and keep the price up, because when you buy something and reduce the supply, the price goes up. Okay, Bretton Woods really collapsed when Nixon did this in '71. And we moved into an era of global free trade where capital can move around the world freely. People can, goods can increasingly. People, I mean, I say people can more than they could in the past. In the EU, definitely, you know, you can go between countries without showing a passport, or, you know, once you're, well, if you live there, you don't need it to go from Bulgaria, from Hungary to France or the Netherlands. So now we have a global free trade order. Tariffs were reduced as a result of a series of trade agreements, the GTO, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades. It was replaced by the WTO, World Trade Organization, and they took some of the sovereignty over some sorts of regulations with nations used to have, and so it's been controversial. There was an anti-globalization movement and a pushback well before our current president began a trade war with China and talked a lot about us being cheated by other nations. So anyway, so until now, the Great Recession of 2008-2013, where banks really lent too much money to themselves, really created too much money for themselves, and were playing a lot of games to squeeze profits out of the transactions between themselves and other banks. But often you heard homeowners being blamed, people who bought too much house and suddenly couldn't pay their mortgage. Well, there was more to it than that. Some of these mortgages were kind of sneaky. When I and my ex-wife bought a house, we wanted a fixed rate loan and not a variable rate loan, which was where you have a low rate in the beginning and then it balloons. It goes way up after a couple of years. Somehow we were getting calls from people saying, well, we've got all your loan paperwork set up. We just need your signatures. And I'd say, who are you again? What kind of loan is this? I could easily, if you're not asking questions, you could easily go into one of those. But anyway, there was excess and some opportunistic behavior. People who were very wealthy who let their house go into foreclosure, or one of their many houses. So anyway, the Great Recession. Many of you remember that, but if not, you're getting a worse taste of what that was like, and it was like. We're approaching the levels of hardship that haven't been seen historically. So here we are, once again, a chart I just pulled today, initial unemployment claims. Here's where it begins, when the lockdowns and stay-at-home orders started. This is the United States. Peaked in early April, and then it's been dropping. Okay, but that just means someone goes for the first time. They've lost their job for the first time. So it's still high, way higher than it was than normal for the first part of the year. So as I said, the other shoe is yet to drop, I'm afraid. Okay, so you may wonder why I spell this like this. I'm following the British style because in the United States, they've started to capitalize all these letters, all caps, but it's not an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything. This means coronavirus disease 2019. It doesn't stand. Anyway, why capitalize all of it? But anyway, I think that's, the style manuals are, have a tyrannical effect on how people write in the United States. I have the freedom to choose how I'll express it. So that's what it is. It's easiest for me. But this is the coronavirus I'm talking about. So, or the disease caused by that virus. Where a coronavirus. There are many coronaviruses. This one is called SARS-CoV-2. This is the second coronavirus known to cause SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome. So I think I'd talk about that in the next lecture, which was actually an earlier lecture. Official unemployment rate right now, 10.2%, but that's probably an underestimate. Gross domestic product, I already mentioned total value of goods and services. Here's the percent change from the preceding quarter. This is economic growth. So it's been running between 2 to 5%. President Trump's goal, his promise was at least 3%. It's not quite averaged out that, and it's definitely with this. Okay, so we see a 5% drop in the first quarter, at the end of the first quarter, which was January, February, and March. April, May, and June is the second quarter, and we have, if it's annualized, that's multiplying it by 4, what it would be for the year if that persisted, 32.9%. It never got that bad during the Great Depression. The biggest ever was 10% in 1958. I'm not sure what happened then. Anyway, this is bad. This is shocking. And yet the stock markets until today, I think, who knows, maybe it's continue to go up. The word was, the worse the coronavirus numbers got, the higher the stock market went, because that convinced them that there would be more government aid coming in. And there has been government aid. There's been a lot of spending. Right now, I think the impasse in Congress is between a $1 trillion package that the Republicans endorse and a $4.2 trillion package the Democrats endorse. Now, bear in mind, there have been trillions spent already on this. And some of it has been used fraudulently. You may have heard about the fellow in Miami Beach who claimed to have businesses he did not, applied to the Paycheck Protection Program to get money to pay his imaginary workers. One of his workers, he paid $10,000 in his log. That worker's name was Mom. He spent a lot of money at jewelry stores, online dating services, and spent $381,000 on a Lamborghini. Well, he is in jail. There's at least one person in Houston did the same thing. I'm thinking one of my neighbors got in these apartment complexes, suddenly got a very loud, shiny new Euro looking sports car. He's all the time driving it around the block as fast as he can, and I'm guessing he's staying with his girlfriend, and they're looking for him because anyway, pardon me. But people have been abusing it. You've heard about Harvard University taking money from the program. The biggest, most helpful, useful part to everyday people was the $600 a week extra for unemployment compensation. That, if they, well, anyway, that's generous, really. But most of that's just going to flow back to landlords and grocery stores and cable companies and internet companies. So it's just a pass through. It's not like it's getting put in someone's pocket. Republicans don't like being too generous. They believe, and you'll hear this if you take economics, it creates a moral hazard. Makes it likely people will not work. If they can get by without working, they will not work. Now, you may recall Marx said that is our nature, to work, to create things. We can't help it. But all right, so what else did I have here? You know what? I'm thinking that, I'm on the wrong one again. I may have got off track. I'm seeing this presentation in 2 views here on 2 screens. So anyway, if you didn't see that, here's the unemployment claims chart I mentioned. Only this year, by quarter. No, it isn't by quarter. It's by less than that. In week, pardon me. I'm getting. Here we have the gross domestic product extrapolated for the entire year as if that last quarter is what it would be. So it's probably not going to be, maybe down 15 to 20% for the year, but that is significant. That is major. All right. Just some robot stuff for your entertainment. And if you choose to, some of these words might be worth knowing down the road. So feel free to download this and keep it and review it. I believe these came from the textbook, the free text we use in my sociology course. And if I forgot anything to talk about, anything that's going to be on the test, well, I told you what's going to, oh, I know what I did not say anything about yet. So modern monetary theory, which you may hear more about. It's not endorsed by, let me stop share because I don't have anything to share. All right, modern monetary theory. It's a theory, it's called neo-chartalist. You remember chartalism, the idea that a government spends money so that it can tax. I believe that's how I define that. Let me make sure I've got the right the state creates money so the citizens can pay taxes. Modern monetary theory is called modern because it's current. There's been, I just got a book I haven't read yet called The Deficit Myth. They would say government deficits don't matter because it's the government that creates money in the first place. And they spend so they can tax. They don't tax people to get money to spend. They're spending the money, giving it to people so they can call it back in the form of taxes. Well, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but basically what it comes down to is deficit spending doesn't matter. All you have to worry about is inflation, because if you're putting too much money into the system, prices will go up, because as I said, if there's too little money, prices are going to go down because that money gets split among all these goods. Whereas if there's too much money, prices go up because you divide, again, let's say it's 10 cars and the money to be spent on 10 cars is $100,000. And that's all, let's say that's all there is in the economy, imaginary thing. I criticize economists for doing that. I'm just trying to explain this concept. So you got 10 cars and $100,000. Each car costs $10,000. Well, let's say you have $100 million. Each car costs $10 million. The price has gone up because there's more money. The amount of goods, if it went up to match, the price would stay the same. So inflation is when the price is going up as a result of one thing or another. Deflation is when prices are going down. It is bad. It is bad. Because it starts this spiral, this death spiral. People lose their jobs, prices go lower. They lose their houses, prices go lower. And I did not explain the reason that if you're in debt, you like inflation. That's because you have a contract to pay back a certain amount of money. Inflation, in essence, you're paying less money back as inflation proceeds. If you owe somebody $100 and inflation has been such that you've been given wage increases just to stay in the same place, that $100 you give that person at the end of this period, whatever it is, may have been just $50 at that point, maybe worth $50 worth of other stuff. So you have gained as a result of inflation. Debtors like inflation. There was a big bump in inflation in the late 80s, the late 70s. That is probably responsible for the fact that many people my age, but not me, have a very valuable house and have, were able to borrow against it and make investments and all these other things. These are the rich boomers you may hear about. All boomers are not rich, by the way. You would be surprised how many are not. These generational boundaries are, I think they're really for marketing more than anything else. Not to say that people are not products of their times, but I worry about the fact that we have deficit spending, and maybe the modern monetary theory people are right. And it doesn't matter. By the way, part of their plan, the way it would have to work, what would have to happen for an economy run according to the principles of modern monetary theory, is there would have to be a very large and extensive government work program, because unemployment is going to be a problem quite often as a result of a variety of things. But you have this as a backup, and not necessarily social programs where people get money for not just for having hard times. What has been theorized is that this would be in like a home care for the elderly. Your job, there would be more and more people making a fairly minimal income, but it would be available, doing things like that, providing some service, rather than making something which could ironically offset inflation. The MMT people, modern monetary theory folks, don't worry about inflation, which a lot of other economists, even on the left, even radical left-wing economists, say this isn't going to work. You will just have inflation and we're all going to be worse off, except for extreme debtors. They say, well, if inflation becomes a problem, you just tax the money back so that you don't have as much money chasing these fewer goods, and that brings prices down. Well, maybe that would work. It's hard to say. But anyway, we're spending, deficit spending has reached a proportion of our GDP that's historic in order to address this pandemic and keep the wheels turning. You could say it's to keep the economy propped up, but it's also to keep people propped up and alive and paying their bills, which, they could just have a holiday on bills. In the ancient world, if you've read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, you've heard about Jubilee. Every so often, the ruler would say, okay, all debts are gone, no more debt, because they would get into a situation where the economy would freeze up because everyone was in debt. There was no money to keep things moving. So Graeber here would argue we need a Jubilee. If you're really interested in the ins and outs of this and the deficiencies of mainstream economics that you will be taught, this one probably you would have trouble with before you'd studied economics. But it is Money and Government, a challenge to mainstream economics. You will read about the history of money, credit. This is where all the stuff why I talk so much. You see all these little flags. In theory, there was something there. I thought I should say something about. This was just reading in, and of course there's not enough time. Anyway, speaking of time, that is the end of my time. This is the last, as I said, I'm using a lecture from spring of 2020, April, for the final lecture, but this is my final appearance on camera, I believe, this semester. It's been a pleasure helping you learn, facilitating your learning, trying my best to deal with problems with Canvas and our libraries, films, and everything else. So good luck. If you're taking the final, which many of you don't have to do, good luck on that. I'll be giving a review for the final. So I'm wrong. You'll see me on, and it's not film. You'll see me live or not shortly after. Whatever it is, whatever you call this recording, you'll see my digital avatar out there going over what to know for the final, mostly, except for those things I mentioned in this. And I may mention them anyway, but you won't know what they are. Because the final thing you should know something about. What does the acronym MMT stand for? And if you've watched this, you know it's modern monetary theory. Right there. Modern monetary, well, let me share it so that you can see it. Right there, modern monetary theory. So you can write this down. I encourage you to write that down. And those other things I said would be on the exam, pause the video and write them down. Okay, it's quite likely if that term I mentioned is in these key terms for review, it might be, no, don't take definitions from there. Take it from the other. Take it from the stuff above. All right, so anyway, this is definitely not in those key terms for review. This is too new. All right, stop the share and stop the recording. This ends government, the economy, a little bit about work.